Lucas is a teenager straight from Netherlands. 2 weeks ago, he went to his first ever hard techno rave. After a couple of beers and maybe funny Mitsubishi pills too, he had an idea. Whoa! If I become a hard techno DJ and producer, I will also play my music in this club. That would be cool. Fortunately, Lucas had a friend called Adam that knew a thing or two about music production. He taught Lucas basics of Ableton, including where he should install all the cracked plugins. Lucas was learning very fast because on his first rave, he also met Sarah, a raver girl that Lucas will try to impress with his productions. After these 2 weeks of intense study, Lucas tried to raise up Sarah, but he failed miserably. I finished my first track at 4 AM and I exported a wave file, a 32 float bit wave file to be precise. I went to school and after the lesson, me and Sarah went over to my place so she could listen to my techno. I played my track through speakers and she liked it, so she told me to turn it up. So I did it, and suddenly the track sounded like it had Taco Bell for dinner. Congratulations, your track was clipping. Clipping? What's clipping? Well, in analog world, clipping is a form of distortion that occurs when an amplifier is overdriven and attempts to deliver an output voltage or current beyond its maximum capability. In digital audio, it's like you try to deliver an audio signal that is louder than either your file format or the device or plugin you are playing your music through can handle. For example, an MP3 file can't handle an audio signal that is louder than 0 decibel full scale, so that signal in the file is going to end up distorted. Okay, but yesterday I played a wave file, not an MP3 one. So where did the distortion come from? Interesting, isn't it? You should come over to my place and I will show you a bit of math. Let's begin the explanation with an analog sound. This is a sine wave, a perfectly round one. If you had an oscilloscope, you could grab any point of that waveform and read its corresponding voltage level. We would have infinite number of voltage levels to describe infinite points of that sine wave. If we want to put this sine wave into a computer file, it needs to be quantized. Instead of assigning a voltage level to any point of the wave, we will assign a number. We also can't sample every piece of that wave. We have to do it periodically. How often we can sample the wave and assign to that sample a number depends on the sampling rate. Usually, it's fixed and equal to 44.1 kHz. Let's assume we have this many opportunities to sample the wave and assign a number to each sample. That range of numbers is also limited and depends on the bit depth. The exact bit depth you can choose when you export the track. If it was possible to export the sine wave as a 2-bit wave file, we would have 4 different numbers to assign to each of these points, because 2 to the second power equals 4. Now let's assign to each point the closest number and our 2-bit sine wave could look like this. Not so round, right? A 4-bit sine wave could look like that. Despite the same sampling rate, I have more different numbers to assign to each point, so a 4-bit sine wave looks a bit more similar to the original one, but it's still far from perfect. The difference between our digital and analog sine wave is something we can call a quantization error. In 2-bit sine wave, that error can be this big. In a 4-bit sine wave, this error is smaller. Adam, in Ableton, I have decibels that go from -infinity to 0, not numbers and not powers. Sure, so let's convert these numbers into decibels now. We can use this formula. On top, we have number 1. This relates to 0 decibels full scale. That's the ceiling you shouldn't cross in Ableton. On the bottom, the number 4 relates to -12 decibels. It means that our dynamic range varies from -12 to 0 decibels full scale. Look at Ableton now. If I play a sine wave with a peak volume of -12 decibels full scale and reduce the bit depth to 2 using Redux, the whole sound will be gone because its volume is lower than our dynamic range. To make the sine audible again, I would have to add a bit of gain. If we used a 4-bit wave file using the same logic, we will get the dynamic range from -24 decibels full scale to 0 decibels full scale, or dBFS. Now in Ableton, I will increase the bit depth to 4. we can still hear the sine wave as its volume is within the dynamic range. So let's turn down the volume of it until it disappears again. Using more maths, we would discover that a 16-bit wave file has a dynamic range from around minus 96.3 dBFS to 0 dBFS. A 24-bit one would have a dynamic range from minus 144.5 dBFS to 0 dBFS. But a 32-bit float wave file, yes, the one you used to impress Sarah, has a dynamic range from plus 700 dBFS to minus 758 dBFS. Which means that a 32-bit float wave file can hold either a sine wave or a full track with an amplitude way over 0 dBFS. That's impossible. No, it is possible. Float means that now we can also assign a floating number to an audio sample. We can still assign an integer number like 4 or 1, just like in our 2-bit wave file example, but I can also assign 0.8, for example. If you put 0.8 into our logarithm formula, it's equal to like 2 dBFS. You are being a smartass now, Adam. If 32-bit wave file has so large dynamic range, then why my track sounded distorted? You see, the fact you can export a 32-bit float file doesn't mean you can put in that file a signal with a volume higher than 0 dBFS and expect the track to sound good everywhere. Let's see that in Ableton. I made a simple project with two sounds that give almost plus 12 dBFS on the master channel. At first listen, you might think that everything about this track sounds okay, but if you are a seasoned producer, maybe you could already notice that there is some distortion inside. What's the fact is that the master channel is clipping, meaning that any peaks and signals over 0 dBFS will be aggressively shaven once the track is exported with certain settings. Let's see that. I will export this project 3 times. As a 32-bit float wave file, as a 24-bit wave file, and as a MP3 file. This is the waveform of a 32-bit float wave file. You can see that the signal is far above 0 dBFS ceiling. When I zoom into the waveform, we can see the peaks are cut. Or maybe they are not. After all, plus 12 dBFS is far less than theoretical plus 700 dBFS a 32-bit float wave can handle. I'm going to turn down the gain fader now. You see, Lucas? You couldn't believe a 32-bit float wave can hold this loud signal. Now let's do the same with a 32-bit wave and a MP3 file. The difference in waveforms is drastic. Due to the file format, the audio signal we exported from Ableton got distorted. Now let's listen to these files. If I play a 32-bit float wave file, I will need to just turn down the volume a bit to get rid of that distortion we could hear earlier. If I play such a wave file through my phone with full volume, the track will sound distorted too, unless I turn down the volume a bit. But if I play now a MP3 through either my phone or laptop, that distortion is audible regardless of playback volume. You see, Lucas, you were almost lucky to play Sarah a 32-bit float wave file. If you only didn't turn up the volume, you could really trick her into thinking you are a good producer. You are lucky you didn't make her listen to your track through Spotify though. Why? Many streaming services, including Spotify, support 16-bit wave files because they take less space than, for example, 32-bit float wave files. If you uploaded your tracks there, they would take your 32-bit float wave and convert it to 16-bit wave, meaning you will lose everything above 0 dBFS. I was wrong, Adam. I thought you were just bragging, but this sounds really useful. Thank you, Lucas. I want to show you one more thing. I will return to my Ableton project and use utility on the master channel to bring down the volume of the track. As you can hear, there is no distortion anymore. Even so, on individual channels, the volume of the kick and percussion is far above 0 dBFS. That's because Ableton processes all the sounds inside using a 32 bits float bit depth. As a proof, let me freeze and flatten the kick channel. If we open the clip, we will see it's a 32-bit float wave file. Thanks to that, the output of individual channels can be stored with no quality loss despite the volume being over 0 dBFS. The signal is later passed to the master channel, where I turn down the volume. We listen to the master channel output, where the volume is below 0 dBFS, so there is no distortion audible in the sound. Oh, cool! So whenever I have problems with clipping, I can just turn down the volume of the master channel until the track sounds clean, right? No, there's no way you can be happy in life unless all your mixer channels are green, just like my T-shirt. Lucas, you have to assume that whenever you cross the 0 dBFS ceiling, you will have problems. Let's say my kick drum needs more compression. I want to use T16 Frontier limiter. But as you can see, the threshold goes up to 0 dBFS. I played the kick drum with default settings on this limiter and the kick is already being compressed. I have no control over the plugin. If I kept the volume of the kick under 0 dBFS, a limiter won't compress it with default settings. And that's how you should drive the sound towards plugins to have control over them. Okay, Adam, riddle me this. I downloaded Waves plugins as you taught me, and I have heard they need to have the input signal volume at around 0 decibels to sound well. I think you didn't hear everything then. It's true that some analog emulation plugins say in manual that you should drive the sound to 0 decibels, but they are talking about 0 decibels on the plugin's calibrated VU meter. VU is a different unit than dBFS, and as you can see, a 0 dB VU, so the volume you should hit, is equal to more or less minus 18 dBFS, so it's still below the ceiling. That makes another reason why I want to keep the volume everywhere below 0 dBFS. There's one more thing. There will be a moment where you will ask me to mix your track, so you will probably want to export all individual channels as a separate WAV file. To export everything as a separate file, by the way, if you will want me to either mix and master your track or to give you a private music production lesson, you can find more information on my drillmusic.com website. You can also write me up directly on Instagram. After all, Adam is going to be very busy explaining to Lucas everything he should know about music production. You will probably select all the channels, and then in the export settings, you will change the rendered track setting to selected tracks only. Be careful because this exports the output of each channel, not the master one. In situation where the master channel is green, so below 0 dBFS, but everything else is red, all the channels exported to 24-bit WAV files will be distorted. If you had everything under control, you could avoid many problems, regardless of the bit depth. Alright, making all the channels in the mixer red was the first mistake Lucas did in his music production career. As you could see, this seemingly simple thing that beginner producers often neglect can lead later to various difficulties and problems with your track. It's been a long time since I made a tutorial while trying to be a bit funny, so if you are going to like this video, you can expect in future more mistakes from Lucas, from which we will everyone learn.